Navigating the combination is about the real decisions in combination product development, the trade-offs, the judgment calls, and the things that don't fit neatly into a guidance document.
Each episode, we sit down with leaders from across drug delivery to talk through what's actually changing and the strategic challenges of bringing a drug device combination product to market.
This is what we've learned. Let's help you do it right the first time.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Navigating the Combination. I'm Jonathan Amaya-Hodges, joined by my co-host, Parth Kothari. Today, we have Max Lerman, who's Associate Director of Solutions Engineering here at Suttons Creek, and Courtney Evans, Principal Consultant here at Suttons Creek.
We had a little bit of a different conversation today. We had two of our regulatory experts have a follow-on discussion where they talked about themes raised in a recent podcast episode. They spoke about going deeper on FDA enforcement trends, combination product compliance gaps, as well as lessons from a high-profile remediation program.
We hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, Max and Courtney. Welcome to the podcast today.
Hi,
Thank you,
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Hi, Parth. Thanks a lot.
Maybe we can start out with some brief introductions to the audience. Max, do you want to say a little bit about yourself first?
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. My name is Max Lerman. I've been Suns Creek for about 3.5 years. Before that, I worked at FDA reviewing infusion systems and more generally complex drug delivery systems. So think things like emergency use auto injectors, infusion pump, all sorts of complex implantable systems, electroporation devices. And I worked there for about 3.5 years. And before that, did the graduate level work with infusion pumps. And before that, I helps develop and build electrocautery systems coming out of Medtronic. So had a unique background both in private industry developing products, researching my own elements, reviewing systems, and now consulting. So it's really a pleasure to be here and talk about these very interesting, let's say, compliance and oversight topics that I think really influence the trajectory of development, probably an outsized amount that we all really appreciate.
Thank you, Max. Courtney?
Thanks, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here today. Of course, my name's Courtney. I've been in Suttons Creek now just about 2.5 years. And similar to Max, in my past life, I was a total product lifecycle reviewer with the FDA, as well as a team lead, specifically for the injection devices team. So a lot of interfacing with CEDAR and CBER in regards to injection system combination products, drug delivery systems. So everything from your pen injectors to your standard auto injectors, large volume auto injectors, on-body delivery systems, etc. I was with the FDA for about 4.5 years. And then prior to that, in my past life, I was a test engineer in a materials science laboratory with some extensive degree of quality as well as GLP testing experience.
Excellent. Thank you both.
Well, it's really great to have you both on, and why don't we just get started with some of these topics that we've been talking about. So, Max, I'd like to start with you. In a recent episode, we had a guest who made quite an interesting point. He said something along the lines of CAPA in pharma is very action-oriented. It comes out of investigations, whereas on the device side, it's a bit more systemic, and it talks about addressing trend violations as well as major issues. The challenge that combination product companies often have is trying to bridge these two. What are some common pitfalls when a pharma heritage organization tries to adopt a device-style CAPA?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. And I mean, having grown up in the medical device industry, the way I see these things being less effective, and I think it's also kind of like common pitfalls, people kind of focus on the what and then not circle back to the how. And in the best case, and I think in the base case, that is how the CAPA system is supposed to operate. I think the challenge with pharma is you're very focused on those actions, what we need to do, what's the next step, let's move this project forward, and maybe not give enough time, maybe not appreciating kind of what the overarching effect may be, what the totality of the system is to cover, considering when is it a one-off or it's a repeated event that we need to investigate further, and trying to in some ways let the system do what it's supposed to, but also maintain the discipline over the long-term effect so that you're adequately informed, you're adequately educated, and that what to do when there's time to raise that effect and not being nervous to raise that effect, right? Like there are going to be times that management's going to have to get involved. There are going to have to be probably challenging conversations about what it means for your next step, your next delivery cycle, for your next product evolution. but knowing that like the long-term effect of what you're doing here and maybe the challenges that you're discovering as part of your CAPA system are in fact the evidence that the CAPA system is working, that you're doing what you want to do, what you want to maintain safe and effective products in the long-term life cycle, and you're delivering the best entire therapies for your patients.
I'll echo what you just said in terms of going beyond that short-term evaluation and thinking about what the long-term looks like. Courtney, as a follow-up for you, how do you coach teams on something that's a CAPA action versus maybe something that's more of a systemic CAPA?
I echo a lot of Mac's sentiments and what he was able to share, but I think one of the core things, the foundational elements that I attempt to get clients to understand is that you're more in the driver's seat in your design of your drug delivery system as compared to your drug product. Your drug product usually has a well-defined sandbox. It's informed by a lot of very standardized standards, like you have USPs, you have things that you are typically conforming to that define the sandbox for you, depending on what your product type is. When you are developing a drug delivery system, it's different. You are the architect. What does your design need to do? And what that means is that there are more inherent interdependencies that are unknown and probably less established, or at least established by whatever you decide, that you're paying attention to. And so when you are looking to maintain and improve on your system, your CAPA needs to be sufficiently robust and more systemic in this case in order to be able to have adequate oversight and control and autonomy of how your device is performing throughout its life cycle.
And just to add to that, I think also approaching this from like what are the similarities versus what are the differences, allowing people to kind of operate within their own mental model. Good manufacturing practices, good documentation practices, and good lab practices are required across both, right? So let's starting with kind of those core, this is the right environment to operate in, I think is a good way to kind of bring people into kind of those new steps in the process that you just start to consider.
Absolutely, Mitch.
Great. To switch gears a little bit now and expand our horizons a little bit into suppliers and supplier oversight, which is a very common topic in combination products. In the other episode, our guest shared that FDA audited a critical supplier and brought those 483s back to the sponsor. And that was the first time he'd seen something like that. And it highlighted the criticality of supplier management. Courtney, how has FDA's approach to supplier oversight evolved for combination products?
I think it's first important to establish, and this is my personal opinion, I don't speak for the FDA, but supplier is a bit of a misnomer when you talk about combination products, because while you are technically sourcing and supplying potentially the device constituent part, in so many ways, you are still the designer of your combination product. And so the decisions of the design go beyond just supplier controls in the traditional sense. You are almost the co-developer of that device with your supplier. And so establishing more robust controls is necessary, going beyond what you might traditionally do for a company where you're only sourcing something like a vial, where it's more standardized oversight. And so you have to think about it as more of a developing partner first and foremost, as opposed to a traditional supplier. And that is a similar focus that the FDA is taking to the approach of how they're reviewing and the level of rigor they're establishing for those supplier controls.
Max, anything to add to that one?
Just to add, I think that some of these things that Courtney is highlighting, this has been kind of the philosophy for a long time, at least certainly since Courtney and I were members of the FDA, but I think are now becoming even more codified and highlighted with some of the QMSR adoption elements, right? There's a lot more focus in general on your supply chain. And I think Courtney, exactly what you were saying, approaching the development practice of not you are my supplier, but we are developing this is kind of the long-term, lays out the groundwork for long-term shared success.
And Max, again, to start at least, where do you see the biggest gaps in how pharma companies manage device component or constituent suppliers versus typical drug component suppliers?
So I think that pharma organizations are generally very focused on the safety and efficacy of their drug substance. And I think there's less attention to kind of what what efficacy looks like with that drug product. And to that end, they, like Courtney was saying, they tend to treat suppliers at arm's length, that they let them go off and do their own thing, and similarly may not be sharing enough information to make the developed combination product effective for the intended use. And I'll just give a little story. I was at a conference and a large pharma firm was speaking, and they highlighted it almost as something to be proud of, that they didn't share the risks of their drug with their device suppliers. And to me, that kind of is in a nutshell, is the problem here, right? If you're not telling your suppliers what the risks are, how are you expecting them to do design verification validation for you? How are you expecting them to mitigate the risks for you? How are you intending them to develop a system for your intended use? And I think that there needs to be more and more dispelling this off-the-shelf notion and understanding that this is your product from cradle to grave.
Anything to add to
Exactly.
that?
Sure thing, Jonathan. Exactly that point, Max. You took the words out of my mouth in a sense of, I believe the biggest gap is pharma companies not taking greater control of the device design at the end of the day. The decisions that are made in terms of the subsystem level tolerances, the subsystem level requirements, what actually matters at the subsystem level to make the system work. Oftentimes I see pharma companies almost completely deferring that to their device supplier with minimal oversight, which we have seen, Max, and we know leads to particularly greater challenges in your post market when you are attempting to run investigations or to open CAPAs into observations in the field. Not having that oversight established on the front end tends to be one of the biggest gaps that complicates your life cycle.
It's really about partnership, but in addition to partnership, being able to make sure you're very clear in your communications about what you want and what you need. And so maybe taking a little bit of a step back, I wanted to sort of dig in on the theme of oversight and think about it from the FDA perspective. So we have a lot of combination products that have drug as the primary mode of action. When does CDRH take that lead on enforcement versus CDER?
That's a good question, Parth. I don't think it's necessarily a matter of who takes the lead as opposed to how they collaborate, which is often device dependent, right? Typically, when you have a more complicated system, so we're talking about infusion pumps to some extent, anything with these embedded controls or even emergency use devices, oftentimes there's greater collaboration between the centers, across your review stakeholders in this case. So your device reviewer will often work very closely with your quality CMC reviewer, your clim farm reviewers, etc., to ensure that the potential gaps between the QMS systems are appropriately considered at the system level. So what that means is, as opposed to thinking who's taking the lead, it's more appropriate to think for your particular device type, how might they be collaborating? What level of risk is established here for my device constituent part that would lead to greater rigor within my review? Have I established all of the elements appropriately and done my own work in terms of gap analysis to ensure the pieces are covered? And then at the end of the day, it's also about how you tell the story, because there's no one particular way you have to or you're required to harmonize across the regulations. There's best practices, there's conventional methods, but ultimately it's up to you as the sponsor to tell that story of how you establish quality and how you're controlling that for your combination product. And it's the comprehensiveness of that story that ultimately dictates who's really in the driver's seat at any moment in time.
Yeah, and to add to that, right, the who and how they're working in the background may not be obvious, but I'll say it's certainly common practice for each center to recommend suppliers that may be appropriate for an inspection based on their own risk assessment of a pre-market system. And there may be times that, sure, inspectors may be more comfortable in certain parts of inspection. In theory, they're to be capable of inspecting all sorts of types of products, but they do at times bring SMEs along with them. So if you are, for example, piggybacking, Courtney, on your example, if you're spinning an infusion pump and they've brought along a total product lifecycle reviewer from FDA's infusion pump team to your site, I would guess that they the compliance inspector and the pre-market reviewer are probably sharing notes in the back end and probably really focus on the development of your system because that is what that individual's there. So it's not necessarily the who's leading, but the who is present is probably more informing of what their interest is.
Great. Thank you both for your thoughts on that topic. Now we'll dive into some statistical details here. Really thinking from the pharma perspective, there's more of a focus on attribute data, AQL sampling, that kind of thing, while devices are usually heavier on variables data to meet reliability requirements. Switching between these can expose process capability gaps. In your opinion, when do you think a combination product team should start thinking about this disparity, when to generate that variables data, and what would be the cost of waiting to address that?
Fortunately or unfortunately, it really starts at specification development when you're writing your design inputs, when you're identifying your user needs. Because even the simple thing of how you choose to write a requirement will influence how you can test it, how you can evidence it, and the kind of data that you can show. So, for example, the requirement that the system must not break versus system must be able to withstand pull force between X and Y. Well, those are objectively testing the same thing, but they can be measured in two different ways. That may only be practical with a new product. So then there comes the element of what do we do in remediation activity? Well, we know we need something to fix. Well, we need to expand our system capabilities, leaning on those classic design control methodologies, defining a system that's separate from your existing product, developing new design control documentation, maybe even a whole new DHF for a specific element until you're sufficiently confident that that each part or the total sum of the parts adequately support the intended use in your new regulatory rigor, let's say, should allow you to kind of keep the best of what's going on in the real world while not being punished for meeting a higher safety and efficacy standard.
Courtney, anything to add there?
I think Max summarized it well. But I will share one final point. I think it's important as you're establishing your specifications or remediating them or performing some degree of gap assessment. It's important to really think about what the attribute is intended to, demonstrate or control. And I say attribute in terms of the specification or the feature. What is the design input or that you are looking to evaluate or control or establish for your product? Is it more appropriate to be an attribute? Is it more appropriate to remain a variable or to transition to a variable analysis in such a way that it improves the efficacy of your product while also potentially minimizing the degree of sampling you have to do? So it's important to think about the why in your decisions as well as you're making those transitions.
Those are both amazing points, and I wanted to pivot a little bit and go back to something that happened about 8-9 years ago. And around then, FDA had issued this pre-market requirement establishing 5 nines reliability for emergency use auto injectors. I remember it really well because I was on the other end of it, and me and the team were sort of evaluating the best way to handle this. And now that we have two very intelligent regulatory SMEs here, I'd love to dig into how did the FDA arrive to that 5 nines reliability standard for emergency use auto injectors, and maybe what was that regulatory or that scientific basis behind that selection?
Hot topic question there, Parth. I think there was a few influencing factors on this, and I'm in no means a reliability expert, so I'm actually going to ask Max to help me just a little bit with the second part of that question. So let's answer that piece first, and then we can get into the basis for the FDA. If you can help me out there, Max. The basis for.
Yeah. So when we think 5 nines reliability, look at the inverse. So it's a failure rate of 1 in 100,000, give or take. When we look at the types of products where that expectation is being implemented, it is for those emergency use, lay delivered drug products that are meant to save people's lives. So from a practical perspective, and we're looking at the 5 nines reliability, it's not individual requirements. It's am I delivering dose. From a practical perspective, I think it's pretty reasonable to say, oh, there's a failure rate of 1 in 100,000 if I'm relying on this particular product to save my or save someone else's life. So how did they arrive to that specific number? I can't tell you the exact detail how that rate was arrived at, but from a balance of how to achieve this from a mathematical perspective versus what is reasonably expected given the types of testing that are available and the rigor that they can be done, I think it's actually pretty reasonable. Now, it sounds pretty terrifying when you hear the number flat out, and I think that's probably where your other guest may have been hearing some of this, or maybe it was misinterpreted or reinterpreted, and then ended up in a stickier situation than they initially had envisioned.
Exactly that, Max. And just thinking about it in terms of the internal motivations for that number, when you're really looking at not just process capability, but device design robustness, a lot of that motivation came in that probability establishment. So basically recognizing that and kind of previewing what I think where your other guests kind of heartburn came in is there's no way to test your way out of that or test your way into that. And so the motivation in even establishing a reliability of that degree of rigor was centered around not just being able to test your way into your design, but to be able to design your way into reliability, looking at not just your process and your manufacturing capability, but also looking at the limits of your device design, the inherent limitations of the material choices you're making, the inherent limitations of the mechanism at which you might be actuating your device. So all of those go beyond just at the system level, does this meet a requirement? It's really motivated by what am I able to realistically design into my product? And how am I able to have enough visibility into that to control the reliability? And to Max's point, for something like an emergency use auto injector or emergency use injector period device, those design decisions are that much more critical. And so that's a lot of the motivation behind establishing that's such a high degree of reliability.
If you look at it at face value, just testing it from an attribute standpoint is 300,000 devices. And that's sort of where the sticker shock sometimes comes. And I remember sitting there having a conversation, and the first thing was every time we have to make a change, we have to test 300,000 devices. And that's where topics and conversations around tolerance interval testing and utilizing a little more statistical assessment came in. And I recall that 300,000 doesn't become as scary when you're doing tolerance interval and it's hundreds to thousands of devices.
Yeah, I think taking a step beyond the numbers for this to be affected, and it sounds like right in the environment that you're operating in, this is kind of being built in too, it takes a appropriate culture of quality. Like if we're looking at it just by the numbers, you're gonna be terrified, and also it's unreasonably expensive. Forget the time to do it. But when we're approaching these questions from what do I need to look at it to do this now? What does this look like me from the long-term vision of the future? How is this being developed within my existing CAPA and CR, SCAR, et cetera, your existing production systems and compliance systems? It kind of shows a more general feedback loop and an intention of how do we maintain the safety of the system over its entire lifetime. To me, this topic very well mirrors the first topic, whereas this is the more practical output, and the first one being, well, what does it mean to approach system compliance? And to me, this is just the best example of that, and also the most challenging case.
Exactly, Max. It's the tried and true phrase of the ends typically justifies the means. When you are designing something, especially in the emergency use space, you have to have greater control and oversight. It's more critical at the end of the day. There's literally life and death decisions being made for devices of this type. And just to preview that, the reliability guidance was designed with the intent of supporting emergency use devices and products. So when we talk about the 5 nines, those are the devices that are typically expected to meet that requirement first and foremost. But with that, what that means is when you're talking life and death, you have to know what your device does. And you have to be able to say that as consistently as possible because the severity of your risk is at the highest level. If we put it back into risk management, right? The severity of your risk is death. How are you going to be able to control that in a way that doesn't require you to test 300? I feel like if any emergency use device needed to test 300,000 devices every time it needed to make a change, we would never have emergency use devices in the market. So again, if I know that, what is the FDA actually asking me to do? Have control of your design. So your supplier is not your supplier. They're your design partner, and you are the driver of your design. They listen to what you need, in a sense. And I know that's in practical terms, that's easier said than done because more often than not, companies are looking to be efficient by designing platforms or grabbing off the shelf systems or well established systems. But even then, if something were to arise downstream, at the end of the day, you're most responsible. Never mind what's in your supplier's DA. You have to answer to it.
Thank you both for your detailed answers to that important question. I think to wrap things up here today, I want to ask a more general question to both of you, which is what does a proactive quality culture look like in a combination product organization? Really thinking about that before FDA shows up at the door.
To me, I think this
Take
is
it first.
it's rewarding discovery, rewarding continuous improvement, management being receptive to the need to improve and not willing to accept the status quo. The idea that we are all fallible it's kind of needs to be built in and recognized, but also knowing that we're going to discover new things, we're going to discover ways to improve and being willing to hear that and adapt it and not sweep it under the rug. And I think the organizations that do this well tend to stay out of the news, let's say. And eventually, is there are many well-known examples of organizations not paying enough attention to these signs, the warning signs that there may be something either too many flags, too few flags, that your quality, the culture quality is just not there where it should be expected, and recognizing too that you're gonna have your own blind spots and welcoming outside approaches, so internal audits, external audits, etc., to make sure that the appropriate attention is being brought within and that you have built that your organization to be the best version of itself.
Absolutely, Max. I second all of that. And I'll just use it as a moment to reemphasize that it is being proactive with improvement. If you have a more proactive model, a more proactive structure, you understand at the end of the day, changes will happen. They have to happen, especially when we talk legacy products. Building a system that is flexible and lean enough to respond to change, to proactively expect that change and to build systems of checks and balances that doesn't wait for the change to happen, but anticipates it in such a way where we know we have to evaluate our suppliers at a typically greater frequency than we may have originally considered. But it's in an effort to ensure that we understand what material sourcing we have. We have robust oversight of their quality system changes. When you're more proactive with those things, to Max's point, you tend to stay out of the news.
So, well, thank you both for your answer to that question and for spending your time and energy with us today. Appreciate your insights and glad we had a chance to speak with you.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for the invitation. It's been great.